Welcome back, everyone. Today we're going to tackle course materials related to preparing for exams as well as thinking creatively to wind up our module on thinking outside of the box. Let's dive right in. Whether you realize it or not, final exams are just around the corner for this term. So here are some general considerations preparing for those exams, whether for this course or another. Number 1, those who get confused or doubt themselves are better off studying alone. In other words, whenever you're likely to second guess your studying efforts, it's always best to rely on yourself rather than others that might feed those anxieties or apprehension. Those whose learning styles indicate that they're social learners are better off studying in a group, or at least with one other person, even if that person might be online, such as the free tutors that are available to you through your Rose State enrollment. Organize the material needed to be studied into 40-minute portions and take a break after each portion. Statistical data and research have shown that after about 45 minutes, most of us lapse our concentration, and that can be incrementally, perhaps even exponentially damaging. Write down any names, dates, and formulas that need to be memorized on an index card, and continue to review them until the exam, typically when you're not in an active studying session, such as when you're waiting for an extra class to begin. There are actually online programs and applications for you to create your own flashcards, so you can even work on your phone. So, how to create a study plan. This is a repeated studying versus repeated retrieval practice by the landmark study done by Roediger and Karpik. We've already mentioned Roediger and Karpik a little bit earlier this term when we talked about why it's so important to take good notes. When there's a 5-minute delay versus a 1-week delay, you can see that there is a degradation over time of how much we can remember. That's why it's best to study in small chunks over a long period of time than to try to cram the night before any particular exam. So, how can you create the appropriate study environment? First, you need to tackle scheduling by asking yourself what time of day you learn best. Some of us learn best during optimal hours between 10 and 2. Others of us are night owls or morning people. So scheduling studying time around those intervals is likely to increase your overall success. What activities do you have to work around, and how many exams do you have? How much time exists from now until exams? In other words, you're not always going to make ideal decisions on the amount of time you can cram for a particular exam. So, portioning out that time and keeping course notes together and separate from other courses is a valuable part of your studying. Whenever you do use your notes, put the notes in chronological order. In other words, spend at least one session organizing your study space. That way you'll be less stressed. It can maximize your overall time whenever you have it in your schedule, and ensure that you have all the resources that you need, such as a textbook, calculator, and of course, contact information for your instructor and perhaps even a classmate. With that in mind, we're going to look at another video from Thomas Frank, who's going to give us some brief test-taking tips. In this segment, Frank discusses tips for studying and preparing for taking college exams. So as you carefully watch, I'd like you to identify no fewer than 2 or 3 tips that you might apply for your own study habits. Here we go.
Today's video is brought to you by the French philosopher Voltaire, to whom is attributed the aphorism, "Perfect is the enemy of good." It's a good reminder for this video because I'm going to give you 10 specific tips that you can use today to both prepare for your exams more effectively and also perform better on those exams when you're actually taking them. The thing to remember here, though, is that 10 tips are a lot to take in at once, and if you try to execute on all 10 of these at once, you're not going to have good results. So, when you get to the end of this video, pick 1 or 2 that you think can help improve your specific test-taking abilities, and then try to put those into action. Let's get started. The first tip has to do with the few minutes immediately leading up to your exam, and it's to do a test preparation ritual. Now, in my mind, this ritual has 2 specific components. Number 1, if you're prone to test anxiety, then the first thing you're going to want to do is pull out a piece of paper and write out the specific things that are worrying you. As we talked about in my video on test anxiety, a study done at the University of Chicago actually proved that students who did this got better grades on their tests. Now, the next component of the ritual is to bring up any important information you have loaded into your brain right now onto a piece of scratch paper or the margin of the test if you can. This includes formulas, measurement conversions, and other important facts that you're afraid you might forget during the test, but that you think you might need. The second tip is to be on the lookout for later questions in the test that might provide insight or answers to earlier questions. I've actually noticed tests that I've taken in previous classes where this has happened. Later on in the test, I'll find a question that references something in an earlier question, and it might actually flat out give the answer. To put this tip in more general context, simply go back and look over your answers after you're done with the test. That way, anything that references anything else in the test is going to catch your eye. Tip number 3 is to do a cheat card exercise. Now, in some classes, a teacher might let you bring in a cheat sheet or index card filled with notes to assist you on the test, but usually this isn't going to happen. Still, go through the exercise of making this cheat sheet. Going through the exercise of forcing yourself to try to condense all the material you're studying for the test into one little summary is going to help you learn the most important parts of the material. Even if you're not allowed to bring that resulting cheat card into the test, you've now gone through an exercise that has really efficiently encoded the information in your brain. Now your brain basically has that cheat card stored inside of it. And this is just a simple way to exploit the fact that the brain learns best through active recall. It learns best when you have to work hard to pull information out of your head. At the same time, you're also forcing yourself to think critically about what information is the most important. What is going to fit on that little 3x5 index card? When you combine those two factors together, you'll find you're studying the most important information in the most efficient way. With tip number 4, we're staying on the active learning, active recall train, but this time the tip is to create quizzes out of your notes and lecture materials and then force yourself to take them. Just like the cheat card exercise, you're forcing yourself to condense the most important information you're studying into a more compact format, but then you're also bringing some pressure into the situation by forcing yourself to take that quiz. Now, speaking of that, the next tip is to try to simulate the test conditions as best as you can when you're studying. This means going to the testing room to study, actually simulating the time constraints of the test when you're taking your quizzes, and also getting your hands on old practice tests that you can study from. Basically, do whatever you can to make your study sessions mirror the actual test. Tip number 6 has to do if you find yourself stuck on a question during a test. And if this happens, try to visualize your study area. Now, the reason you want to do this is because research has shown that learning is context dependent. For example, in one study, half of the research participants learned something on land, while the other half learned something while underwater in scuba gear. When tested on the recall later, the students who learned with the scuba gear on underwater actually were able to recall the information better when they were back underwater in said scuba gear. What I'm trying to tell you here is that you should study underwater. Now, this is not a new discovery, and another good example of this comes from the philosopher John Locke, who wrote about a young gentleman who, having learned to dance, and that to great perfection, there happened to stand an old trunk in the room where he learned. The idea of this remarkable piece of household stuff had so mixed itself up with the turns and the steps of his dances that, though in the chamber he could dance excellently well, yet it was only whilst the trunk was there. Nor could he perform well in any other place unless that or some such other trunk had its due position in the room. Now, the English is a little weird in that passage, but I'm sure you can get the point. This all comes back around to visualizing your study location when you're stuck, though, because other research has shown that people who do this are sometimes able to overcome the effects of context-dependent learning. Basically, that means that if you happen to study in the library and then you visualize the library, the memory of that study location might help you forge connections to the material you're trying to recall. Tip number 7 is to try doing at least one of your study sessions while out on a walk. If you're having trouble grasping a certain concept, then try going on a walk and reviewing it while you're outside. Now, many people actually find that when they're doing physical activity and they're outside, their brain makes better connections. But you're getting an additional benefit as well. While you're outside, you're looking at the problem from a different perspective. Barbara Oakley's book, A Mind for Numbers, points out that doing this helps you review a concept and learn it while independent of any environmental cues of one specific place. My 8th tip is to apply Hofstadter's law to the act of studying. Now, Hofstadter's law states that it always takes longer than you think, even when taking into account Hofstadter's law. Encoding the information needed to earn a certain test grade is almost always going to take you longer than you expect it will. Yes, I know you're absolutely certain that later on tonight you're going to study really hardcore, but then your friends are going to come in and want to do something. Or a 5-minute study break is going to turn into a Netflix binge. This is just simple reality, and smart people plan around reality. So, take the date that you're planning on starting to study for your test and try moving it back a week. That way you're giving yourself ample time to review and revise, even if things get in the way you didn't anticipate. Tip number 9 is to be deliberate about taking on your small tasks and grouping them into as few small, concentrated blocks of time as you can. This will free your time in your schedule to create large, uninterrupted blocks of study time. Now, when you're doing this, as a general rule of thumb, try to put those uninterrupted study sessions as early as you can in the day. This is because your willpower is a finite resource, and if you use it all on small tasks earlier in the day, you're not going to have as much left over for that big study session you need to get to. This is where the saying, eat your frogs first, came from. Do the hardest things when your willpower reserves are as high as they can go. And we are finally to the last tip, and it is simply to appreciate test-taking as part of the learning process. Viewing tests only as assessments, as basically judgments, makes them scary and causes undue stress. Instead, try to see your tests as beautiful, concentrated bursts of recall and application. And you can also reduce further stress with CATs. So that is it for this video. If you found it helpful, you can always leave a like down below to help support this channel.
Alright, folks. Hopefully you acquired at least 2 or 3 test-taking tips, but probably the most important that Frank shared is the fact of Hofstadter's law. That is, it always takes longer to study than you think it's going to take, which is why we're talking about exam preparation today rather than just a few sessions before final exam week. Alright. So, according to the Wall Street Journal, testing yourself repeatedly, another thing that Frank mentioned, teaches the brain to retrieve and apply knowledge from memory. Frank dubbed this active recall. The method is more effective than rereading a textbook, says Jeffrey Karpik, that same person that we looked at in the Roediger and Karpik study. If you're facing a test on the digestive system, practice explaining how it works from start to finish. Sleep also plays a role in test performance, but in 2 unexpected ways. Review the toughest material right before going to bed. That approach makes it easier to recall the material later, says Dan Taylor. And then, don't wake up earlier than usual. This could interfere with REM, or rapid eye movement sleep that aids memory, he says. So, if you're really stressed out and you absolutely know that you're not going to be able to study until tomorrow morning, just go to bed earlier, and actually go to bed earlier, so that you can have sleep intervals of 90 minutes. So, how to attack specific questions. Number 1, multiple choice questions. Try to hide the answers and answer the question without looking, and then look for your answer. Absolutes are rarely correct in MC or multiple choice questions. In true-false questions, be cautious of the words always and never in a statement. For a statement must be true and must all be true. Consider true-false questions a lot like questions that might be asked in a trial setting. Could a jury absolutely convict or exonerate a particular answer? And finally, the essay. Brainstorm, then organize. I can't stress this enough. It's very important to even create a small or simple outline for all of your material before sharing it with your reader or submitter. So with that in mind, imagine that Regina has come to you with a problem. She's had to miss class 3 times since the start of the term and is panicking over her midterm exam. She isn't sure if the notes she's taken belong to chapters or friends' notes she borrowed. Worse, she took pictures of slides for 2 sessions, and none of the information she has images of matches her exam prompt. How might you devise a plan for Regina to get back on track before she begins studying for her next test? Well, number 1, the advice I would give Regina is to contact her instructor sooner rather than later. Be forthcoming with the fact that she didn't have a very diligent attendance record, and then begin by asking the instructor questions about her notes. He might advise her to go back to particular chapters. He might even have some suggestions for getting her back on track. In addition to that, he might be willing to share images of slides, etc., or at least exfoliate or amplify her understanding of that. My other suggestion is that she should go back to the individuals that she borrowed those notes from and consult with them about how to best organize her notes in a way that's best appealing to her study strategies. So, here are some exam-taking strategies for the actual exam date. Number 1, try to show up 10 minutes early. That way you have enough time to calm yourself down, check those messages, etc. Go to the washroom and have everything you need with you, including extra pens, pencils, etc. Dress appropriately, warm on the outside but cool on the inside. And then try to write facts, formulas at the top of the exam ASAP as soon as you get it. That way it won't be competing for memory space in your mind. Try to read over the entire exam and then develop a plan. In other words, determine the amount of time you need to spend on each section and what questions to start with. And then return to the questions you're not sure about after you've answered all of the questions on the exam and take the time to check your answers. Don't forget to write your name at the top of each page, just in case, and then submit it when you're comfortable that you've thoroughly gone over every part of the exam. So, let's switch gears and talk a little bit about creativity, folks. Let me ask, do they have a 4th of July in England? If you answered no, you're wrong. Of course they have a 4th of July in England. It's just not a national holiday. So as you can see, we're starting to consider critical thinking and creativity. So now that we're in the swing of things, here's another one. Why can't a man living in the USA be buried in Canada? Did you get it? Because the man is living, and hopefully you won't bury a man anywhere, much less Canada. How about this one? There are 3 apples, and you take away 2. How many do you have? If you answered 1, you're wrong, because remember, you took away 2. How about another one? I have 2 U.S. coins totaling 55 cents, and 1 is not a nickel, so what are the coins? Here's a little hint. Remember, it says only 1 is not a nickel. So that means if 1 is not a nickel, then the other one can be a nickel. So if your instinct was to guess a 50-cent piece at a nickel, you'd be correct. In all of these, reading carefully is the source of critical thinking. So, last one. 2 women play 5 games of checkers, and each woman wins the same number of games. There are no ties. Explain this. Better question to ask, because critical thinking always begins with the right question. Does it say in this formula that the 2 women played one another in checkers? No, it doesn't. So that means that they probably just had different opponents, and they won the same number of games. Hopefully somewhere more than 3. But it doesn't matter. As long as they played a different opponent, they could win the same number of games with no ties. That's how we explain it. So, with that in mind, folks, let's talk about the creative or critical spark. We would define this as the application of imagination in personal, professional, or social outcomes. So that means there are different kinds of creativity, also different intervals of creativity. Typically, we define or describe these in 2 ways, divergent and convergent thinking. Divergent creativity or thinking is the generation of multiple solutions to a problem. In other words, being an innovator. If you've ever heard someone say something like, there are at least 8 great vacations we can take this summer that cost half as much as a theme park. That means that they're thinking outside the box and coming up with as many ideas as possible. Divergent, diverse. Convergent thinking is deductive refinement for optimal solutions. Now that I have all the data, the simplest remedy to our immediate cash flow is to refinance the loan on our property lease. In other words, you take a bunch of possibilities and you distill them or dilute them into the best decision that you can make. So in other words, creative problem solvers can be either divergent or convergent, and we all need to refine and render more sophisticated our divergence and convergence in order to create creative applications. So let's discuss some of those applications. High creativity is developing an innovation that produces seismic changes in a field or discipline. So, if you rediscover relativity, or if you develop an engine that runs on water or garbage, then that's high creativity. Somebody that can change an entire field or discipline. Productive creativity is refining and developing skills, knowledge, and talent that showcase your individual expression. In other words, you can use either divergent or convergent thinking to find ways to do the things you do better and put a personal stamp on them. Elastic creativity is devising ways to stretch boundaries and possibilities for individual achievement or overcoming prevalent obstacles. In other words, let's say you want to be a cybersecurity agent, but you're not that good at math. Finding ways to use convergent or divergent thinking to overcome your obstacles is a way to create a more elastic solution to your challenges. And finally, personal creativity. This has been you just deploy imaginative thought for personal expression and growth. In other words, you want to dye your hair, or you decide that you're going to design your own t-shirt or desktop background. All of those are personal creativity. They're still using divergence or convergence, but they're using them on the level of individual expression. So, How do we kill creativity? Well, if you hear phrases like, "you're not paid to be creative," "what will this do to your reputation," or "we tried that and it didn't work," then that's feeding into the myth that outcomes and creativity are mutually exclusive. But the reality is that failure and exploration, just as you learned whenever we talked about growth mindset, are often required for innovative output. If you also hear things like "follow the rules," "don't rock the boat," and "don't ask questions," then you're succumbing to the myth that paradigms are ends unto themselves. In other words, sometimes rules are meant to be broken, and boundaries can require scrutiny to fulfill their purpose. If you hear something like, "I'm not very creative, this isn't my job, and what did we do last time?" then what you're really hearing is somebody saying that creativity is an inborn trait, and they either have it, or in this case, don't have it. But creativity can be cultivated through practice, and we'll find out some of the ways that you can cultivate creativity in the next several slides. Number 1, creative experimentation, related to growth mindset, is an open mode of thinking, a willingness to engage ideas without preconceived demands or outcomes. Its characteristics are relaxation, in other words, thoughts that are allowed to permeate rather than be pursued actively. It's egalitarian, in other words, it's equal. Each idea is given equal weight or respect, and it allows us to explore, to evade conventional solutions to problems. Experimentation, refrained from self-criticism and editing, and that open mode of thinking seeks new ideas as their own reward, because even if they don't pay off today, they might pay off eventually if we'll just let our mind sizzle on them long enough. Elizabeth Gilbert says, in Your Elusive Creative Genius, the question becomes how. So it seems to me upon a reflection that the way that I have to work now in order to continue writing is that I have to create some sort of protective psychological construct. She continues, and what I have to sort of keep telling myself when I get really psyched out about what that is, don't be afraid, don't be daunted, just do your job, continue to show up for a piece of it, whatever that might be. If your job is to dance, do your dance. In other words, sometimes the risk of creativity causes us to take smaller, baby steps instead of seismic changes. Those baby steps can add up over time. Tell you what, we're going to watch just a brief segment of The Surprising Habits of Original Thinkers by Adam Grant. Questions to ask yourself are, how do creative people come up with great ideas? Organizational psychologist Adam Grant studies what he calls originals. These are thinkers who dream up new ideas and take action to put them into the world. So, I'd like you to identify how Grant describes procrastination and failure in the creative process, and support your answer with course materials or personal experience.
I'm a precrastinator. Yes, that's an actual term. You know that panic you feel a few hours before a big deadline when you haven't done anything yet? I just feel that a few months ahead of time. So, this started early. When I was a kid, I took Nintendo games very seriously. I would wake up at 5 a.m., start playing, and not stop until I had mastered them. Eventually it got so out of hand that a local newspaper came and did a story on the dark side of Nintendo, starring me. Since then, I've traded hair for teeth. But this served me well in college, because I finished my senior thesis 4 months before the deadline. And I was proud of that. Until a few years ago, I had a student named Jihei, who came to me and said, I have my most creative ideas when I'm procrastinating. And I was like, that's cute, where are the 4 papers you owe me? No, she was one of our most creative students, and as an organizational psychologist, this is the kind of idea that I test. So I challenged her to get some data. She goes into a bunch of companies. She has people to fill out surveys about how often they procrastinate. Then she gets their bosses to rate how creative and innovative they are. And sure enough, the precrastinators like me who rush in and do everything early are rated as less creative than people who procrastinate moderately. So I want to know what happens to the chronic procrastinators. She's like, I don't know, they didn't fill out my survey. No, here are our results. You actually do see that the people who wait till the last minute are so busy goofing off that they don't have any new ideas. And on the flip side, the people who race in are in such a frenzy of anxiety that they don't have original thoughts either. There's a sweet spot where originals seem to live. Why is this? Maybe original people just have bad work habits. Maybe procrastinating does not cause creativity. To find out, we designed some experiments. We asked people to generate new business ideas. And then we get independent raters to evaluate how creative and useful they are. And some of them are asked to do the task right away. Others we randomly assign to procrastinate by dangling Minesweeper in front of them for either 5 or 10 minutes. And sure enough, the moderate procrastinators are 16% more creative than the other two groups. Now, Minesweeper is awesome, but it's not the driver of the effect. Because if you play the game first before you learn about the task, there's no creativity boost. It's only when you're told that you're going to be working on this problem, and then you start procrastinating, but the task is still active in the back of your mind, that you start to incubate. Procrastination gives you time to consider divergent ideas, to think in nonlinear ways, to make unexpected leaps. So just as we were finishing these experiments, I was starting to write a book about originals. And I thought, this is the perfect time to teach myself to procrastinate while writing a chapter on procrastination. So I meta-procrastinated. And like any self-respecting procrastinator, I woke up early the next morning and I made a to-do list with steps on how to procrastinate. And then I worked diligently toward my goal of not making progress toward my goal. I started writing the procrastination chapter, and one day, I was halfway through, I literally put it away in mid-sentence for months. It was agony. But when I came back to it, I had all sorts of new ideas. As Aaron Sorkin put it, you call it procrastinating, I call it thinking. Take Leonardo da Vinci. He toiled on and off for 16 years on the Mona Lisa. He felt like a failure. He wrote as much in his journal. But some of the diversions he took in optics transformed the way that he modeled light and made him into a much better painter. What about Martin Luther King Jr.? The night before the biggest speech of his life, the March on Washington, he was up past 3 a.m. rewriting it. He's sitting in the audience waiting for his turn to go on stage, and he is still scribbling notes and crossing out lines. When he gets on stage, 11 minutes in, he leaves his prepared remarks to utter 4 words that change the course of history. I have a dream. That was not in the script. By delaying the task of finalizing the speech until the very last minute, he left himself open to the widest range of possible ideas.
So, folks, how then can we develop that same creativity? Believe it or not, the things that Adam Grant mentioned have already been mentioned by professional comedians over time, in particular John Cleese of Monty Python fame. He says that if you choose to and procrastinate to become an original, you need to cultivate something called spontaneity, the capacity to embrace novel solutions, just like Martin Luther King did when he devised the phrase, I have a dream. He also says that creativity is corroded through something called solemnity, which is the presumption that serious problems need to be infused with sober thoughts. In other words, if you have a serious challenge or problem, you should be able to joke about it, because this can create the kind of divergent thinking that will propel you to think outside the box, and because what Grant calls an original. You also need to endow yourself with a creative community, who have the following characteristics. Number 1, they evade critical or judgmental attitudes. They have the capacity to discuss serious topics with levity, going back to our earlier observation, and they foster the capacity to laugh at yourself. In other words, to enter a growth mindset where you see that failure is never a permanent state. Humor, if we can make the observation, then provides the opportunity to speed up our relaxation that's required for the open mode of thinking that we spoke about on an earlier slide. So, How do you deal with your time creatively, just like Grant spoke about? Number one is the idea of incubation. This is the process of allotting definitive time to contemplating and engaging solutions, and understanding that creativity often requires conscious dismissal of trivial and urgent problems. So how to set creative deadlines for yourself? There are internal, those that are self-imposed time limits to the open mode of thinking, which usually don't last more than about 90 minutes. And then there are external, constraints based upon needs supplied by instructors, employers, and your greater social network. Extended contemplation often permits your intellect to wrestle with your solutions unconsciously. Just like Grant, when he came back to his chapter after several months, he had a whole new slew of ideas, even though he wasn't actively thinking about completing that chapter on originals and procrastination. In other words, whenever you consciously stop dealing with a problem, your unconscious can often take over, and that's the time when you can be in your greatest open mode of thought. So, how do you then cultivate a creative space? Number one, you want to devise an optimal environment, a location that facilitates sufficient conditions for creative solutions. This might be a safe place, or it might be a place that you're not accustomed to, that you especially allocate for creative and divergent thought. Creative spaces can often permit discomfort and uncertainty in a low-stakes setting. So, for example, your favorite coffee shop might create minimal distractions, but they really do then cause you to focus on the tasks at hand. Here are a couple of traits. You want to evade trivial distractions in a creative space. Compel confidence and a willingness to embrace failure. And finally, a capacity to display your accumulated solutions. So, for example, if it is a home office or even the bed in your room, you want to create a pegboard so that you can display all of your ideas, that your subconscious will be continuously reminded of them and continue to work on them. Creative spaces accelerate transition in a closed mode to open mode of thinking, which can often relax you and allow you to laugh at yourself, since you see that failure is never a permanent state of affairs. Finally, let's talk a little bit about the traits of critical thinking, folks. We'll divide this into three sections. The first is analysis, which is the capacity to distinguish the parts of a task or a problem. In other words, if you've heard a person say, this assignment is really asking for researching the topic, then converting the data, then that person is beginning an analytical journey. After analysis comes assessment. This is when we get into convergent thought, appraising the problem or task based on rational criteria. Is the only reason I want to buy a new car because I just broke up with Canvas? I don't know. But assessing that solution is going through a process of appraisal and getting to the heart's blood of our challenges and problems. And finally, awareness. Knowledge regarding related issues or concerns. The real reason this political candidate is complaining about freeloaders is to protect the revenue of those higher tax brackets. In other words, finding the reasons behind the reasons makes us more aware and often causes us to make better overall decisions. So, your discussion journal and related to this particular chapter is to identify which form of creativity, divergent, convergent, you're most comfortable channeling when devising solutions for personal obstacles. Discuss in 150 to 200 words a moment in the last year when you deployed creative thought to solve a problem, and use keywords from today's lecture or your course textbook to enhance your response. I'll be looking forward to those responses, folks, as I continue to refine and populate your gradebook. In the meantime, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me.